My name is Carlos Mendoza Álvarez. I'm a Mexican citizen and a Dominican priest of the Order of Preachers. I've been a Dominican for 42 years and a priest as long as 37 years. So my experience in the Dominican Order has been also in some way exploring two kind of ministries, particularly intellectual life as a scholar in different universities. For 30 years I've been teaching. And then the other part of my ministry is what I call the pastoral ministry with artists, social movements, and people in the peripheries. Well, I was invited in 2021 to attend the Winter Living Theology and to offer some lectures, but because of the pandemic, it was not possible. Father Russell Pollitt was in charge of this initiative at that time, and we couldn't prepare in person the visit, so we did only online some sessions. But it was difficult because, it's very different to meet the people in their own places and their country, their culture. So that's why the Jesuit Institute reconnected to me and then said, well, come to South Africa. Well, of course, South Africa, for Latin Americans represents a symbol of struggle for freedom because you were facing apartheid for several decades. And then the dignity of the people of South Africa has been, for many of us, like a reference, a moral, ethical, spiritual reference for other peoples who have been struggling for freedom, for dignity, going away from different kinds of process of colonization, slavery, racism, poverty, and so on. So South Africa represents for us a symbol, a compass of humanity, of freedom and dignity. And of course, when I came here, I realized that you South Africans, you have a more critical approach to your own history, particularly after 31 years after the end of the apartheid. And I was surprised by this kind of criticism, which I understand better now. I've been here for a month, 30 days, and visiting different communities in Durban, Johannesburg, Cape Town, also Port Elizabeth or Gqeberha, something like that. Well, and tomorrow we'll be attending important gathering also in eSwatini, former Swaziland. So I'm very curious about all different groups of people, nations, white, black people, people of color, colored people. I understand better this expression now in South Africa. So I'll be discovering a great country. Probably, I would say, well, an audience which is diverse because many of them, they're elders and youth, clerics and lay people, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and trying to connect with all of them, all of those groups has been challenging for me, but at the same time, a source of inspiration, trying to listen young priests, for instance, who are mainly accompanying communities in poor neighborhoods like Soweto. I was very impressed by the community in Soweto, the parish there, San Martin de Porres, St. Martin of Porres, as you say in English. By the way, the first black person who has been canonized in the Catholic Church in the 60s by Pope Paul VI, and he was a Dominican brother in Peru. So I was very happy to discover that this parish is protected, accompanied by St. Martin of Porres, and then the pastor, the priests who are there, gorgeous characters, really following what Pope Francis was inviting us some years ago, to really be close to the community, live with them, listening to them, and then engage in real conversations with the community. So I was very impressed by Soweto experience. But on the other side, I visited Pretoria University, and I was really impressed by the experience of some scholars from theology department, but also architecture, social sciences, who have been involved supporting unhoused people, particularly refugees, but many other kinds of people who are houseless, not homeless, because they have home. Street for many of them is home, their friends, their communities, their families. So houseless people. How a university involving in this process of building facilities, but also creating networks and supporting the networks among the people themselves. So that was a very important experience. And because of this connection, I had the opportunity to visit refugee camp, people from Democratic Republic of Congo, a group of more or less 12 families. 7 years ago, they were expelled by the war in Congo, and they were asking for refugee status here in South Africa. But they received a very, minimal support from the United Nations Program for Refugees. And for 7 years, they have been struggling for life. Some of them leaders, particularly men, they were in jail for 2 years. So the children, they don't know what school is about. And they are struggling in a very difficult way because they don't feel welcome anymore in South Africa by South Africans. And they say, our brothers South Africans, they don't welcome us anymore. Of course, it's a very important challenge for South African society. According to United Nations, I think there are more than 250,000 refugees in the country from different parts of Africa. So, of course, this is a very humanitarian challenge, I'm going to say, humanitarian crisis. So what it represents today for South Africans, welcome those refugees, and how can we support them? So that was part of my experience visiting different communities here in South Africa. I noticed a real proximity from the elders who were experiencing 60, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the struggle of South African people for freedom. And liberation theology in South Africa at the time was a very important reference. Great authors. I would like to mention one of my brothers, the Dominican theologian Albert Nolan. But there were many others, of course. And then Cairo's document, who was really a reference in order to understand how Christian communities would be really involved in this post-apartheid time. So I had immediate connection with that generation. The people, the youngest priests, for instance, and some lay leaders, they were like shy talking about this issue of post-apartheid times. And I was also challenging the communities, connecting different kinds of exclusion. Because following Pope Francis, really carefully, listening to the peripheries, we need to open our hearts, our minds, in order to listen to those who are living in the peripheries. Visiting this refugee camp in Pretoria came to my mind this expression, they live in the shadows of the shadows of the shadows in some way. But there are many people living in the shadows. Of course, the colonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon, the grand founder of the colonial thinking, started to reflect differently about racism, connecting racism to other kind of exclusion. So those who live in the shadows. And when I was introducing this topic, particularly connecting social justice questions to gender questions, disability questions, people were not very comfortable, particularly about gender issues. Of course, when I presented some challenges coming from disability studies, scholars who have been exploring what disability is about. It's about new ways of living our bodies, also a new way of living temporality, but also spirituality. Disabled people with disabilities, they have a different spiritual experience. And we need to learn to listen to them and to learn from their experience. But when I was connecting this kind of narratives, coming out narratives from the shadows of disability. Two other kind of shadows, gender exclusion, particularly queer communities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc. communities. Then the people, they were like afraid. They were saying, oh, well, this is not a real, like a condition of life. It's a choice. So the people, they can change their way of living. They don't get at the time, when I was talking about that, I think, the great challenge of gender diversity. The awareness of South African generations today about the challenge you are facing as a country, as a nation, the rainbow nation doesn't exist anymore as a dream, as an utopia. For new generations, probably. The elders are also disappointed because of corruption of the new governments, because of a lack of accountability, the lack of a real reform about the land, the territory, because the segregation is still there. And I've noticed that for the first time visiting South Africa, I felt that in something similar to what was going on in the United States because of racism is still here. I mean, this kind of segregation between two different groups. In the middle, the colored people, they're trying to navigate who they are and how they exist and what kind of belonging, right? So that struck me very much. And the second element is about the double belonging, talking about spirituality and how the ancestors' legacy in African culture still there, is alive. And for me, it's a great opportunity for African peoples in order to decolonize their spirituality and then decolonize their way of Christianity came into this continent, similar to what happened in the Americas. We need to decolonize this very Western pattern, as Western-centered pattern, was driving our minds, our imagination, our religious symbols, and so on. So the question of double belonging, how can we engage conversations between the great African heritage of healers, for instance, to connecting to the Christian spirituality? I think there is a great opportunity there in order to explore new ways of Christianity. Of course, it's up to you, South Africans, to open your imagination and create new paths in order to engage a deep conversation, including all the voices, the marginal voices in this society. From my experience in Mexico, in Brazil a little bit, in Colombia, in the United States, what I can say is that to overcome polarization, which is now like a common trend in different societies, we need to listen carefully those who are different, to think different from us, and engage in good dialogue, real conversations, face-to-face. And a second aspect that I've been discovering with the victims facing violence is that if we really start from our own vulnerability, this conversation, we can engage a creative dialogue. So connecting wound to wound, because all of us, we have been experiencing a kind of violence as victims or perpetrators. Survivors of victims and survivors of perpetrators. So that's why it's very important to touch this deep dimension in our lives. We call that vulnerability, right? If we are able to do that, then we engage a new conversation. There is a more symmetrical way to address the other. It's not from a position of privilege, and then I'm engaged. I'm listening to you because, well, I'm ready to help you. It's not about that. It's how can we engage a real mutual conversation together. Listening to For instance, the mothers searching their children in Mexico. I've been talking a lot about this during the talks in South Africa, sharing my experience with the audiences here. The searching mothers looking for their children in mass graves, in prison, in farms controlled by criminal mafias, and so on. In my country, by the way, more than 150,000 missing persons in the last 20 years represents a great challenge. It's a war against those people who live in the shadows of the shadows of the shadows. And the strength coming from the mothers, the searching mothers, many of them elders, is what for me represent like the power of this process overcoming polarization, because they connect each other through their wounds. Their tears matter, the loss, their grief, the mourning process, because looking for a child who has been disappearing for years, months, or days is a torture. But and they got depressed in the beginning, but when they open their heart each other, when they listen each other, they create bonds among them, and a strength is rising from this experience of grieving together, listening each other together. This is an example of vulnerability, but as a source of new agency. The victims in that way become survivors. And because they are survivors, they are fighting for life amidst death. And that's what the Palestinians are doing, by the way. I've been including also in the talks a talk about Gaza, because Gaza represents like is the symbol of this catastrophe we are facing in so many different levels, of course. The ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people by the Israeli state and army and all the governments, the US government supporting them, European Union, a lot of industries of war. Well, Gaza represents the collapse of the modern dream of universal human rights. And Palestinian theologians like Mir Raheb, like Munter Isaac, philosophers like Rana Huri, many scholars, but also spiritual leaders, Palestinians, Muslim and Christians, they have been really talking, speaking out in order to understand what's going on today in Gaza. Gaza represents, on one side, the collapse of this modern dream of universal dignity for all, except for those who are like a trash population. But at the same time, Gaza represents the compass for humanity because of the people there resisting this violence. They call that this resistance sumud, which is facing violence with imagination, care, taking care also of the death of the survivors, and then imagine something new, creating in the rubbles of their cities, their towns, their houses, something new. So Gaza is a symbol, is a call for all humankind in order to reshape our idea of what humanity is about. What is about to talk about peace and justice from the rubbles of society. In every society there are little Gazas where people are in some way destroyed, annihilated because of gender, because of racism, xenophobia, and so on. So we need to connect all these resistances. And then there is a strength coming there. And I think that's the only way we can talk about hope. The main topic of this series was about hope and healing, collective healing, in order to engage a process of hope. And hope is about dignity and life for all. That's why I think we need to keep really in our hearts, in our minds, what Gaza represents today. And I think this is exactly the spiritual dimension of the new bonds that the victims can create. They're able to create new bonds because they welcome their vulnerability and others' vulnerability as a source of strength. Of course, the colonial thinking helped us to understand the power, the potential of the poor, of the victims who resist violence. Mimetic theory, on the other side, help us to understand also that all of us, we are beings of desire. But many times the desire that is supporting us in order to connect to the others is a violent desire. It's not a pacific desire. It's not a pacific mimesis. It's a violent mimesis. We need to sacrifice somebody in order to preserve the harmonious community in our lives. But it's a fake path. René Girard, who proposed this theory 60 years ago in France and the United States, used to say this is what satanic path represents, thinking that if we exclude somebody on behalf of the unanimity of the community, we're reproducing more and more evil. But there is a messianic path, the path of the Messiah, of Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee, in the cross, in the resurrection. He was facing a scapegoating process, as many other victims in history. And he dismantled in his own body this hatred and this process of exclusion through forgiveness. So forgiveness is not only like a moral resignation against the perpetrator, offering the perpetrator forgiveness and then in the afterlife, God giving us all his mercy. No, forgiveness is also a social process, a political process of restoration of the humanity, human society. And that's why forgiveness is absolutely relevant, because it's the spiritual source of new political bonds for humanity, and particularly in times of catastrophe, it's more and more relevant. So I think if we are able and willing to talk about hope, we need to be really very careful, not talking about hope in like a naive way, like something coming from heaven. Yeah, what about our agency as human beings who are really willing to engage real listening and conversation with others? Could talk about some experiences. The most recent experience was the experience in Boston. I was there for 5 years at Boston College as a professor. And I would say a senior scholar. And I was working, trying to connect. I was invited to join the theology department of Boston College to connect Global South to Global North. And then engage in theological conversation, listening in the peripheries, and that was fine. I received a very warm welcome by my colleagues and the institution too. But at the same time, the last year after the genocide in Palestine, I started talking about Palestine and welcoming, inviting some Palestinian scholars, and talking about that in the classroom, in my publications. And I started to experience a kind of rejection or awareness about, this is a difficult topic because we need to avoid anti-Semitism and so on. Of course, I said, I'm not justifying Hamas attacks or any kind of hatred against the Jewish people, but the state of Israel is different. It's the monopoly of a biblical narrative talking about a territory, the promise of land as a territory for a particular nation. And I experienced a kind of censorship, not directly, but in a more hidden way. And then that's why I said, this is probably not my place. Some of the undergrad students, they became aggressive when I was in the classroom talking about gender issues, Middle East and Palestine, of course, poverty because of capitalism, society, a capitalistic economy, undocumented immigrants, and criticizing openly the policy of U.S. administration, particularly second term Donald Trump administration. So what I experienced is this kind of grief and then rejection, and I felt very vulnerable because of the risk of deportation or criminalization of my work. Some students have been expelled from the country, from the US, because of this, or also some scholars. The universities are facing now in the US this big challenge, how to engage real research projects about peace building, for instance, in case of war, about Middle East, and as Harvard has suffered, the criticism coming from the US government is very, very hard. So how can I find hope in that situation? And then listening to those who are in the peripheries, and then going back to my country to continue listening to them, accompanying them. I'm becoming, I'm not anymore a scholar. For 30 years I was a scholar. Now I like to call myself as a street theologian.